Hello, this is Frida Liu, and you're watching The Shift Asia, where we cover everything around ESG and sustainability. Now in its 5th year, the EY Global Climate Risk Barometer is an established benchmark that scores the progress being made in both the coverage and quality of climate-related disclosures globally. It examines over 1,500 companies across the world to assess disclosure performance against 11 recommendations of the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The analysis measures companies on a number of recommended disclosures that they make and the extent and detail of each disclosure, what this all means. I'm with Arina, partner, Malaysia's Assurance Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader and Asia Pacific Decarbonization Solutions Leader for Ernst & Young Consulting. Welcome, Arina. I've been wanting to talk to you about this for the longest time, but the barometer in its 5th year. Perhaps we'll start with the key overall findings of the barometer and then zoning into Southeast Asia.
Sure. Thank you, Frida, and thanks for having me today. So I think one of the first things that I wanted to highlight was it was very important for us to have the foresight to at least understand that the implications or financial implications of climate change is going to be very critical, right, not just for society, but businesses. Very simply put is, we have long seen climate disasters, but on a very simplified manner, not many businesses have sized up what the dollar sign or the implication would be. And hence, what would be a very rational cost-benefit analysis to actually mitigate or adapt before they even face with the disaster. So this was actually whereby, for us, we as a firm, as a global firm, we saw a number of national policies as well as jurisdiction directing the focus into climate-related financial disclosure. Right. So that was how the birth of the barometer, EY barometer, came about. And with the 5th edition, I think it's critical to outline and highlight that in line with what we thought with the COP28 as well as the focus areas. Indeed, all organizations, especially the large listed and non-listed organizations, are stepping up not just on net zero commitment and pledges, they have to back that up with real disclosures. Right. As what I would like to call it, a report card. Right. So it's no longer just having a nice hearsay story, but to actually demonstrate what governance look like from board to management, demonstrate what are the risks, how do they size up the risk, what are the strategy and how resilient they are in terms of businesses, as well as how adaptable they are if climate disasters or any transition risks like carbon tax were to hit their operations. Right.
Okay, so when you look at that and you're talking about overall, do we see disparities within, like, I guess Europe and America, and also, as zoning into Southeast Asia?
Indeed. So it's because of, for some of the more developed countries, whereby they do have existing emission trading scheme, which is what you see as a certain form of taxonomy, you pay on your emissions and all. It becomes like a requirement already for them to have emissions reporting and even have carbon tax, similar to Singapore, who have introduced carbon tax since 2019. For every 2,000 ton CO2 emitted per facility, they have to pay, if they exceed 25,000 ton CO2, $5 per ton of emission. Once you have that kind of regime, it's as good as any business have to pay a tax. Naturally, within their corporate reporting, they would have a projection. If the $5 goes to a $10 or a $15, they were able to estimate what's the overall impact to them in the long term. So what we are seeing is, for developed countries that existingly have an equivalent of carbon taxonomy, naturally their disclosures are more advanced towards scenario projection, and to some level, even their strategy on nature-based solutions, which is, for example, venturing into projects that reduce emissions, carbon credits. So these are things whereby it's the next step of maturity that not just country goes to, but corporates also have that kind of strategy play.
Right. And I guess like in Malaysia, we still don't have the tax, we still don't have all these things in place. So I guess, the sense of urgency, right, to move in that area. So, what are the key elements that will impact climate-related disclosures in the next few years? I know there were a couple of things that were listed in the report.
Yeah. So if we look at what's most urgent to business, as we see where our central bank, Bank Negara, have come up with enhanced guidelines when it comes to climate risk stress testing and also looking at climate-related principle-based taxonomy. All the FIs, which includes bank, insurers, asset managers, they now have a very short time frame within end of this year, 2024, to actually come up with a reporting of what they have done in terms of their whole transformation. And when we see a profound transformation for our financial institutions, the focus is on 3 lines of defense.
Right.
So it starts with the front line, which are the relationship managers. What kind of products or what kind of client engagement they know when they speak to their customer? Are you exposed to flood risk? Are your businesses, in the past 12 months, have you faced any challenges of flood, whether your business is in Johor, Kelantan, Pahang? So these are things whereby we will see relationship managers will start to go through that transformation.
Okay.
On the same note, they will also start to be moving away from plain vanilla financing towards green financing or sustainable finance, or even more advanced area, which is transition finance. Anything that reduces emissions or provide them greener solutions, those can be packaged towards better financing options. So second line of defense are very much the risk behind within the engine of business. The risk team will start to evaluate what a risk model look like, not just for the next 1-2 year, but a longer period to 2030, 40, and 50. The last one is the internal audit and external audit. They will start to also see, okay, with all these in place, how does the whole organization transform themselves in the business? So we envisage as, a lot of businesses are reliant on capital market as well as where they get their loans and finances.
Right.
When financial institutions make that move in your day-to-day loan credit financing, that's where businesses will then sit up and say, okay, it's either I do it well and I get better rates, or I have nothing and I get penalized over time with a huge risk that I'm not able to defend the business on.
Right. Okay. Interesting, right? Now, I guess with EY, your conversations are largely, mainly with the larger corporations. When we look and talk about this, does this have any impact on SMEs? And I'm sure it does, but how can you draw me that picture?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is a lot of the large organizations have spent the last 5 years or even so to prepare their own internal report card.
Right.
Once they've started doing this, that means understanding how to optimize their operations and where they have started to make the best of their environment and social aspect. The next part they will focus on is on supply chain.
Right.
So they will apply the same rigor, but tactically they will aim for the large supply chain that they have. Because as consumers, all consumers will start to go down the value chain.
Right.
No difference from if we see palm oil plantation, it's about traceability, it's about social aspects. Now, all those will come for large organizations because once they've learned that it's important to navigate supply chain, no one wants to go through, similar to when we face times of like flood, COVID, whereby supply chain is disrupted. So all these are very similar to building business resilience.
Right.
So what they want to ensure is, for example, if carbon tax comes in, my commodity prices will not suddenly spike because my suppliers have already been forewarned and prepared.
Right.
So they will keep their emissions, energy optimized. So these are the things whereby we do see for SMEs who are within, if you are within the value chain, or your end customers are international business, you will be very much exposed. Unless you are very much operating just within Malaysia, you may be less exposed, but the competition. So it's a matter of timing, because even if you're not in international value chain, the bankers will apply the same lens regardless of you are in the international or local value chain. So two things to watch out: your main customers, and the second one is your bankers.
Right. And I guess also if you supply to the larger local corporations that are in the capital market, they will also follow this as well, right? So the barometer suggested 3 actions that companies should take urgently. So let's dive deeper what it means for companies. So firstly, shifting the mindset from burden to action. What do you mean by this, and what needs to be done?
I think the most clear example and what we've seen is, even if we do not have carbon tax in Malaysia, over the past 1 to 2 years, especially the last 12 months, those who have monitored critically their TNB bills, their electricity bills, or if they are operating in Sabah, Sarawak, tariffs have continued to go up, and the range was within 30%, or to some even up to 200%.
Wow.
Now, with that in mind, not many businesses are able to even think about sustaining their margin if their margin is very thin.
Yeah.
So on the same front note is, if they are thinking to go towards at least renewable energy or energy efficiency, similar to how we've gone through the transformation to LED lightings, those will not only be a good cost-saving mechanism, it reduces emissions as well.
Right.
So on two prong of it, you're able to reduce electricity bills, and you're not exposed to high emission or carbon tax cost risk. Now, this is where we see it's potentially just cost saving. But for large organizations who are not just looking at just savings, recognizing, for example, space is opportunity, right? There has been quite a number of models, like rent your roof. So all those are money on the table. A normal businessman will say that I'm going to optimize, I'm not going to have any square meter of my property or assets not making money, not generating money. So it's the same as I'm not going to have any on my roof not generating energy or money as well.
Right.
So with this, it's very interesting to see that organizations who have started working on risk management, cost-benefit analysis, they start to shift towards, now where's money on the table? So they come to a point whereby they start to have negotiations on longer-term green projects. Because we understand that the moment carbon tax kicks in, similar like for EU CBAM, is 2026. Not many organizations have fully been prepared for that. But for those who have started preparing and who have already have internal carbon pricing within their business, they start to have very clear which green projects will reduce my emissions and energy. Right. So for example, nature-based solutions, or maybe they will go for technology like biomass, biogas to self-generate energy. So these are things whereby it's not something you can overnight when tax kicks in. I will be able to go out to the market and source for a large gigawatt project. So these are things where it's money on the table, but the timing of when you enter, it's very critical.
Right. And of course, I met you at the 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏 event, right? And there was a lot of talk about, companies now putting solar panels, right? A simple, low-hanging fruit and simple solution, right? Now, the other thing that, in terms of action, was to master the data to serve your carbon agenda. How do you go about it? Is that just basically just measuring your data and then understanding your data, then knowing what to do?
We do see for smaller businesses, monitoring your 12 months TNB bills is not difficult.
Right.
Putting in energy efficiency like retrofits, LEDs, automated switches, those are not difficult. And a lot of this requires data automation. So what we see in corporate Malaysia, especially even for large listed organizations, most are still monitoring a lot of their ESG on Excel manual and trying to recalculate it, by year end for reporting purposes. But two utilities organizations that we've worked with in Malaysia, because of the pressure and the need to respond and react, have immediately leaped to make this data real time.
Right.
So what it means is C-suite CEO, CFO, COO, their compensation are tied to real-time data. So it's not that I only get to see my bonus, I only get to react on my ESG report card end of the year.
Right.
It's almost instantaneous that I have to react on a monthly basis, or even if you think about if you're managing water utility,
right,
you can't wait pollution, let me look at my report card of water pollution and end of the year, let me come back to you. So these are things whereby by force or by any considerations you have to fast track. But by going fast track, it puts you ahead of a lot. The question is, with this knowledge, technical and know-how, how do you take it and build a new business model with it? So that's the unique part of when we talk about once you've mastered it, you can actually look at the scale of that solution.
Okay. And then you were talking about the third is elevating the discussion to drive impact. So I guess, is that your example of how, what is currently happening and how can this be elevated, so to speak?
Yeah. And I think when we talk about impact, that's where it's most critical. The younger generations are fast becoming well equipped with real information. Of course, depends on how they validate, invalidate information. But we do see a culture whereby, because they are in an era where information is at the tips of your hand, there is a culture of them analyzing and synthesizing even faster.
Right.
So what you see is there is also the leadership that has vast experience, right? They've seen through the 1998 crisis and all, they know how to navigate market, but they are faced with the younger generation that really have all these data. So the question is, with these two, how do they come together with a synergy to make impact? Now, impact is very important because the most typical day-to-day conversation, buy EV or buy ICE vehicle, right? If you go for EV, yes, but if the electricity is powered by coal, what does it mean?
Right.
So in that respect, the argument between minerals availability, whether are there alternate, not just looking at lithium battery, but hydrogen sources, these are things whereby it's always good to be optimistic, but be very cautious. So you have the very senior leadership who are very cautious and experienced, but you have the young one who are optimistic.
Right.
So you bring that very unique hybrid together. They want to see impact.
Cautiously optimistic, they like to say that, right? How can organizations effectively navigate shifts in ESG trends, especially those that may be different from global trajectories, right? Because, I think we're different in different parts of the world.
I always think when it comes to how you want to drive the conversation is always focus on two things. Number one is, if the solutioning, understand what's the biggest problem that society needs, right? If you understand what are the problem and what are the solutions, then you have a very clear frame of mind. What are what the business purpose is. Because a lot of business owners, they will start to relook at, now, if I'm in packaging, right, will my business still be relevant 5 or 10 years later, right? Yes, maybe if I have biodegradable material. Not really if I'm full plastic, single-use plastic. So these are things whereby having a clarity of why society needs you, it's very important. But why society needs you today versus why society needs you 3 years later is another question.
Right.
The second point I would say is, once we understand the purpose and how long that purpose lasts, the second is always economics. The real reason why business survive is always economics first. If you can't get past economics, the business will not sustain. So for every solution, the margin must be sufficient to be able to drive solutioning. And it's no different if you want to go for anything, there must be a capital funding. Now, what businesses needs to now think of is, okay, a lot are on the mindset where if I need to go green or I need to go ESG, it's a huge money. But the question is, the better question is, have you looked at any R&D, what universities are looking at? For example, alternate to plastic is algae materials. Yes, it's expensive, but there are better sources. So do you then scale from local industry? For example, there are those using fish scales to build plastics as well, right? Or some using cactus plants. So there are a lot of different things that are big globally is being innovated. The only thing is the economics and where to source is the bigger question. So the thing is, I always believe it's not about doing it because it's good, because without profitability, you can't sustain the model. But once you're able to hit that sweet spot, that's where the money comes. So it must go on that very realistic trajectory.
Okay. Budget 2024 will see the corporate initial allowance for information, communication, technology, equipment, and software raised from 20% to 40% starting from this year. How can Malaysian companies leverage on this?
So as I mentioned, even for collaboration, when you talk about initial allowance, it's always in most countries. This will not be permanent. It's always, when you talk about allowances, it's always an interim to make sure everyone start getting used to certain new technologies until you skill. Similar, even for now, even though we are seeing renewable energy is an interim, but realistically, you wouldn't expect allowances to be there for renewable energy once it becomes
mainstream.
And it becomes a price war, which we are seeing right now.
Being commoditized,
Correct. So similar to technology, I think where the government is really focusing on is solution finding, right? Similar to where a lot of organizations have energy efficiency and technology cost budgeted in. Now, if those solutionings becomes a scale, similar to how RE becomes a scale, that's where the government will reassess. That's why even in 2024 budget, there has been allowances on carbon capture as well as storage technology, because these are a new area, right? So in terms of the communication technology, equipment and software, the good thing is they allow it to be fairly broad for businesses, entrepreneurs to actually provide what the technology looks like. So we are going to see not just artificial intelligence, like, a lot of us have now seen ChatGPT. But it's going to be regenerative or generative AI as well, whereby it helps the iteration, right? Good and bad, but to a certain extent, some of these is supposed to be managed to drive efficiency. So we do see that for Malaysian companies, quite a number of the, as I mentioned, entrepreneurs, even for experienced business leaders, they are starting to get very broad view what global technology is moving towards. And how they can deploy these at a very local and fast scale. So they will start to look at not just internal application, but a real business model when it comes. So for example, composting food waste. These are things whereby, truth to be told, we are not good in handling our waste segregation, composting and going for biogas or biomass. But in developed countries, it's all been pushed in a greater manner. So I think to a certain extent, we do see these, at least it allows the 20% raise to 40%, provides a view that the government is really supportive for businesses to go towards at least looking for the economics of things.
And to leverage on what's available for now, because it's not going to be here forever, as you were saying.
Exactly.
Thanks for sharing. A lot to go through, and maybe we'll speak again when the next barometer comes out. I'm here with Arina Kok from EY, and of course, you've been watching The Shift.